There is a drawer in Vashti Combs's workshop in Boone, North Carolina, that she does not open in front of strangers. She will show you her tool rolls, her bending iron, her collection of Appalachian tonewoods stacked by species and age along the east wall. She will set a half-finished dulcimer in your hands and let you feel the cant of the fretboard, the way the spruce gives just slightly when you press, like something living under the surface of the wood. She is generous with her knowledge, but that drawer she keeps shut. Inside it, in a manila folder she bought at a drugstore in Morganton 7 years ago, are 43 photographs. Each one is a close-up of a dulcimer scroll, the carved head at the instrument's near end, where the strings terminate, and the maker's hand declares itself against the wood. Some scrolls are simple: a curl, a tight volute, a small bud. A few are animals. 43 of Vashti's photographs are something else entirely. They are a face. The same face appearing in walnut, in cherry, in tulip poplar, in American chestnut from before the blight took everything. Made across 5 decades, by a man who had never, in any ordinary understanding of that word, seen. That is the thing the drawer is about, not the face alone. Faces appear in folk carving, in the mountain tradition especially, and Vashti knows that better than most. What holds her is the consistency. Lay those 43 photographs across a workbench, the way she has done alone in the middle of the night more than once since Asheville, and what you have is something that should not hold together. The nose, straight and long with a slight deviation at the bridge, always to the left, 3 or 4 millimeters, never more. The eyes closed or very nearly so. The particular angle of the jaw, the way the left ear sits fractionally higher than the right, the kind of difference you would only know if you had pressed your hands against a face in the dark. Slowly, many times, learning it the way water learns a riverbed. She did not lay those photographs out herself the first time. A colleague did. His name is Marcus Hensley, and he teaches instrument history at a music conservatory in Asheville, and he had been sitting on what he found for 3 weeks before he called her. He called her on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, when the color had gone from the trees, and the mountains were showing their full gray skeleton. He said, "I have something I need you to see in person." He would not describe it over the phone. That was the first thing that made her understand the weight of it. She drove to Asheville on a Friday evening, into the smell of wood smoke and low clouds, and met Marcus at the conference center where he had booked a room for the express purpose of spreading things on a folding table. He was already there when she arrived, and he had set up a work light. The photographs were face down on the table in a stack. He said, "How are you?" she said. "Show me." He turned them over one at a time, setting each photograph down without speaking, giving her the time to look. The first 3 she could have explained. The 4th began to do something to her certainty that she could not name while it was happening. By the 7th, she had set her coffee cup on the edge of the table and had not picked it up again. When he had laid out all of them, she stood there for a while. The fireplace at the far end of the conference center was going, and it put a cedar smell through the room, and someone in the hallway was laughing. And Vashti Combs stood between those 2 ordinary facts, and felt the floor of her understanding shift by some small but irrevocable degree. She said, finally, "How many instruments?" Marcus said, 43 documented. He paused. "There may be more." She said, "Same maker on all of them." He said, "Everyone." She looked at the photographs. She said, "What do we know about him?" And that is where this story actually begins. The man who carved those scrolls was named Absalom Rhee. He was born in 1851 in a hollow below Soapstone Ridge in what was then Burke County, North Carolina, and he died in 1903, having made, by the count Vashti and Marcus, eventually assembled, somewhere between 200 and 230 dulcimers in his working lifetime. The number is imprecise. Some instruments were never documented. Some left the mountains on the backs of traders and peddlers and ended up in the flat country below, where they were played until they broke or put away in closets and forgotten. But of the instruments that remain, in private hands, in university collections, in 2 different folk art museums, in a Presbyterian church in Lenoir that keeps one on a display shelf near the door and has no idea what it has. Every documented example carries the scroll. Everyone. The same face, the same specific woman's face, repeated with a patience that looks, across the span of it, like devotion. Absalom Ree was blind from birth. The hollow where he grew up was called Ree's Branch, not for his family but for a grist mill operator named Ree, who had built and abandoned a mill there in the 1820s, leaving his name on the creek the way people leave names on places in the mountains, not because they intend to be remembered, but because names are the shortest form of a deed, and the water had to be called something. Absalom's people came to the hollow a generation later and took the name from the place, the way a family absorbs the identity of a hollow, the way the hollow absorbs the weather, slowly and without declaration. What we know of the family is thin. The historical record for small mountain communities in the mid-19th century tends to thin quickly when you are looking for people who did not own much land and did not appear in courts. The Rees appear in the Burke County tax lists of the 1840s and 1850s, paying tax on one horse, a cow or two, a few acres of worked ground, and rather more acres of hillside too steep to plow. They were neither prosperous nor destitute. They were the people the mountains were made of. Absalom's father is listed in a genealogy compiled in the early 20th century as Ennis Ree, farmer and woodworker. A brief account in the Burke County Historical Society newsletter from 1974, written by a man named Doris Harmon, who had interviewed, 2 decades earlier, an elderly woman who had known Absalom in his middle years, describes Ennis Ree as a man who made chairs and tool handles and a few pieces of furniture that Harmon's source described as plain but sound. Sound is a word people reach for in the mountains when they mean honest. It does not mean beautiful. It means it will hold what you ask it to hold. Ennis Ree began teaching the wood to his blind son before the boy was 5, not out of inspiration or because he recognized in those extraordinary hands the beginning of something. Because a blind child in a mountain hollow in 1856 needed a trade, and wood was what Ennis Ree understood. He put tools in the boy's hands. He guided them. He let the wood teach the rest. The Dulcimer entered Absalom's life through a neighbor, a man named Gideon Prophet, no documented relation to any of the better-known prophet families of the region. Vashti checked, who made instruments as a secondary occupation and who found the blind boy's hands, when he encountered them, remarkable. That is the word from the 1974 account. Remarkable. Gideon Prophet put a dulcimer in Absalom's hands when the boy was 9 years old. What happened was immediate, or is recorded as immediate, which is the way important things are remembered. They become sudden, clean, inevitable. The Appalachian dulcimer, the mountain dulcimer, distinct from the hammered dulcimer of German and European tradition, is a long, narrow-fretted instrument. The body is shallow and elongated, hollow, shaped something like an hourglass, or a figure 8, or an elaborate teardrop, depending on the maker's preference, and the fretboard runs the length of the center of it, fixed, so the player can rest the instrument across their lap. 3 or 4 strings are most common, though some makers went to 5 or even 6, and the instrument is played with one hand fretting and the other strumming, traditionally with a turkey quill pick that gave a particular bright and slightly rough edge to the sound, a texture Vashti describes as honest, which is the same word Doris Harmon used for Ennis Ree's furniture, and which in both cases means exactly what it says. The dulcimer's voice is its own thing, not the brightness of a fiddle, not the depth of a banjo, something cleaner than either. A sound that carries across open ground, but that also fills a room without pressing against the walls. It was an instrument associated, in the mountain communities of the 19th century, with the domestic interior, with singing traditions that passed through women's hands, with the kind of music that happened not on a stage or at a dance, but in the ordinary time of a household, the late afternoon, the evening after supper, the particular quiet that comes when the work is done, and the dark is not yet absolute. The dulcimer was not performed. It was inhabited. What makes a dulcimer is the maker's judgment. the thickness of the soundboard, the arch of the back, the placement of the sound holes, which in the Southern Appalachian tradition were cut in shapes specific to each maker, as identifying as a signature. Teardrops, the outline of a dove, a cross, a scrolled fern frond, the degree of relief in the waist, the taper of the neck. None of these measurements are standard. None of them can be fully specified in advance. They are arrived at, on every instrument, through the body's accumulated knowledge of what the wood will do, which is a knowledge that lives in the hands more than in the mind, and that cannot be entirely transferred from one person to another. It must be developed. Absalom Ree spent the rest of his childhood developing it. He made his first instrument at 14, by the estimate in Doris Harmon's account, relying on what Orpha Deal, Harmon's elderly source, recalled from things she had been told. It was probably rough. Most first instruments are. The second was better. The third, the earliest documented example, held now in the collection of a university museum in Cullowhee, North Carolina. The third is where the face appears for the first time. Vashti drove to Cullowhee after that evening in Asheville. She drove alone, 4 hours on roads that got smaller and slower the closer she came to her destination. Through the particular mountain November that strips the forest down to gray verticals and opens the ridgelines up and makes you feel, if you have lived in these mountains all your life as Vashti has, the specific exposure of a place without its leaves, like a room whose furniture has been moved. She arrived in the morning. She had called ahead. The museum curator, a young woman named Petra, who was courteous and careful with the instrument and with Vashti's evident emotion about it, brought the dulcimer to a table and set it under a work light and stepped back. The body was walnut, dark, close-grained, the patina of 150 years of handling and air sitting in every pore of the wood, a depth that is not surface color but the actual substance of the material changed by time. The sound holes were teardrop-shaped. The fretboard was slightly concave, worn from use. Someone had played this instrument. Many people had played it, across the century and a half since it was made. The scroll was at the near end of the body, small, not much larger than the top of a man's closed fist. The museum's catalog entry described it as an abstract female figure. Abstract. Vashti had read that entry 3 times before she came, and when she saw the scroll in person, she understood why whoever had written the catalog entry had reached for that word. Because the alternative, because saying portrait, would have required the catalog entry to address what a portrait meant, in this context, carved by these hands. She asked Petra if she could hold the instrument. Petra said yes. Slowly, watching Vashti's hands the way a responsible curator watches a scholar with an object, Vashti lifted it from the table and settled it in her lap and turned the scroll toward the light. She held it for 20 minutes. She ran her thumb over the scroll 3 times, slowly, and then did not touch the carved face again, just held the instrument and looked and did not say anything. Petra, to her credit, did not ask. What Vashti was looking at was the nose, with its leftward deviation, the near-shut eyes, the jawline, the ear placement. She was looking at the same face she had been looking at in photographs for the previous 2 weeks, but in the object itself, in the wood, understanding it in a way that photographs resist. Because in the photographs the face is a flat representation of a flat representation of a thing, and in the wood the face is present in 3 dimensions and in the particular temperature and weight of old walnut, and Vashti's hands told her things about it that her eyes could not. She set it down on the table. She thanked Petra. She walked to her car in the parking lot in the cold morning air, got in, started the engine, and sat there for a while with the heater running and her hands in her lap. Then she drove home. She went to her workshop. She opened the drawer, which did not yet have 43 photographs in it, and she thought about what she had felt, not what she had seen, what she had felt. And then she noticed that she had made the same choice that Absalom Ree made every time he was asked to explain the face. She had used the word felt, not seen, and she sat with that for a while in the quiet of the workshop, with the smell of the walnut shavings on her bench and the cold coming through the old single-pane window. and she did not know what to make of it. This is the thing about a craft tradition. It lives in the body or it does not live at all. You can write down the dimensions of a dulcimer, the measurements, the species of wood, the sequence of operations. You can write it all down precisely and hand it to someone, and they will make something that looks like a dulcimer, and may not sound like one, because the measurements are not the instrument. They are the skeleton of the instrument, and the flesh of it is in the knowledge that the hands carry without being able to report on it fully. A kind of intelligence that is not dumb, but is also not verbal. Absalom Ree had more of this than any maker Vashti has studied. More than was explicable by training alone. In the mountains, in that era, the craft passed from hand to hand through proximity and time. You sat beside the maker, you watched, you tried, you failed, you tried again, and the knowledge moved from one body to another through something that resembled transmission, but was also something older than that word. Absalom could not watch. He sat beside Gideon Prophet and felt the older man's hands on wood and absorbed the vibrations of chisel against grain and learned through everything except his eyes. And the account of it, sparse as it is, suggests that the result was not a diminished version of the craft, but a different access to it. An understanding that went through different pathways and arrived, perhaps, in a different place. He mostly said yes. Orpha Deal told Doris Harmon, like he was answering somebody. Doris Harmon wrote this down and published it in the 1974 newsletter between a piece about a church social and a note about a railroad spur, and did not comment on it further, which is either incuriosity or the discretion of a man who understood that some observations require a different kind of context than a historical society newsletter can provide. The line sat there for 50 years, in a newsletter that most people in the county had not read. Until Vashti read it, standing at her kitchen counter on a December morning with her coffee, and set the coffee down and read the line again, and then again. He mostly said yes, like he was answering somebody. She thought about what it would mean if that were literally true. She stood in her kitchen for a long time thinking about it. Then she went to the workshop and got to work, because that is what she does with things she cannot yet think all the way through. She works and lets the thinking happen in the body's time, which is slower and more reliable than the mind's. The dulcimer-making tradition in the southern Appalachians was not a commercial enterprise in any modern sense. An instrument might be sold for a few dollars, traded for a season's labor, or given outright to a neighbor who needed one and couldn't pay. The work was embedded in community the way any essential skill is, not separate from ordinary life, but threaded through its middle, present at celebrations and at grief, at the gatherings where the music was not entertainment, but the form that the community used to recognize itself. The dulcimer was for singing, for the old songs that the mountains held the way a hollow holds water, slowly, a long time, releasing it only a little at a time. The sound of a dulcimer in a room in 1880 was not ornamentation. It was structure. It held the moment in place. Absalom Ree made instruments for his hollow and for the hollows beyond his own. People came to him by the word that passes between people who have needed a specific kind of help and found it. Not announced, not advertised, just known by the people who needed to know. He charged fairly, when he charged at all. He was not a prosperous man. The 1890s tax records show him paying tax on a small parcel of land and a workshop's worth of tools and nothing more. He was not poor either, in the mountain sense of that word, which means something different from its meaning in towns. He was adequate. He had what the work required, and he worked. His reputation was for sound. Everyone who speaks of his instruments, in Doris Harmon's account, in the catalog descriptions, in Vashti's own language when she talks about the 9 Ree instruments she has played, says the sound. Not the carving, not the craftsmanship, the sound. It had a quality that Vashti calls particular, a word she uses the way Doris Harmon used sound and Ennis Ree's neighbor used remarkable. Precisely, meaning a thing with a specific identity, a thing that is not any other thing. You could tell a Ree instrument in a room of instruments, Vashti says, with your eyes shut. And then she catches herself again on those last 3 words. The Methodist minister who came to commission an instrument, he wrote about the visit in his diary, which survives in a private family collection, and Vashti obtained a transcription of the relevant passages, described Absalom as a man of middle height, with hands that, when they were at rest, looked like they were listening. That is the minister's phrase. Hands that looked like they were listening. The minister was not a poetic man. The rest of the diary is mundane records of pastoral visits and weather. The hands caught his attention, and he wrote it down. When the minister asked about the face on the scroll, the diary suggests he asked directly, the way ministers of a certain temperament do, directly and without apology. Absalom said, according to the diary, the wood already had it in it. I find it the same way you find the edge of a table in the dark. You don't put it there. It's there before you reach. The minister wrote, I did not know what to make of this answer. I believe he was sincere. Sincerity is not explanation, but it is evidence of something. The minister kept the Dulcimer he commissioned until his death, and it passed through his family, and eventually it came to a collection where Vashti found it and recognized the scroll. It was the 14th instrument she had documented. The sincerity of the man who made it came with it, in the wood, in the face at the near end. Now the story turns, and I want you to feel the turn before I describe it, the way you feel a change in temperature before you can name what is different. Vashti had been working the documentary record for 3 months when Marcus Hensley called her back. Not the first call, the one before the conference in Asheville. A second call, in late January, when the ground was frozen and the roads in and out of the high hollows were sheets of gray ice. He said, I have one more thing. He sounded careful, the way he had sounded careful before, except this time the carefulness had a different weight to it. The first time she had recognized the weight as excitement. This time she recognized it as something else. Apprehension, maybe. Or the particular sobriety of a man who has found something he would have preferred not to find. He came to her workshop. He drove 2.5 hours in the ice, which is its own form of declaration. He was wearing a down jacket, and his boots were wet from the parking lot, and he accepted the coffee she offered and then held it without drinking it, which she noticed. He had a folder with him. He set it on her workbench, next to the instrument she had been working on, and she moved the instrument carefully aside to give him room. He said, I've been trying to identify the woman, in the scrolls. Trying to find any record of a woman in Burke County in the relevant period who matches the physical description the carving implies. She said, Have you? He opened the folder and took out a photograph. Not a photograph of a scroll this time. A reproduction of a tintype, the kind of small contact print that the wet plate photographers made in the 1840s and 1850s, when the technology was new enough that having your image taken was still an occasion rather than an ordinary thing. The woman in the tintype was seated, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze directed slightly to the left of the camera lens. The way people looked in early photographs when the long exposure times made meeting the lens directly difficult to sustain. The image had the silver-gray tonality of the wet plate process, the smooth softness that the chemicals and the long exposures together created, so that faces in these images often look like they are slightly behind glass, or underwater, or at a remove that is not quite distance. Vashti looked at it. She looked at it for a while. She did not say anything. Her hands were on the workbench, and Marcus watched her hands, and after a moment he picked up one of the scroll photographs from the folder, the one from the Cullowhee instrument, the one she had held for 20 minutes, and set it beside the tintype. He did not say, look. He did not need to. The nose, the deviation at the bridge to the left, the eyes, the left ear, the particular quiet of the face, the expression that was not serene and not unhappy but present. Present the way things are present that are not performing for anyone. Vashti said, Who is she? Marcus said, Her name was Celia Vass. She was born in Burke County in 1820. She died in Burke County in 1851. He paused, and the pause had the weight of the thing it was about to carry. He said, 1851 is the year Absalom Ree was born. The ice outside on the parking lot made a sound like a sheet of paper under a hand. Not quite a crack, not quite a creak, somewhere between the two. Vashti's coffee was in her hand. She set it on the workbench. She looked at the two images side by side, the tintype and the scroll photograph. She looked at them the way she looks at wood she is trying to understand, without conclusions, just receiving. She said, "How did you find her?" He said, "The tintype is from a private collection in Morganton. It came from the estate of a woman whose grandmother had been a neighbor of the Vass family. He had come across it in the course of cataloging the collection, not looking for anything, just doing the work. He had recognized the face because by then he had been looking at the photographs for months." She said, "Is there a connection between the Vass family and the Ree family?" He said, "I've looked. I haven't found one. There is a particular kind of silence that a workshop produces when the work has stopped. Not an absence of sound, but a different quality of it. The tools still, and the wood still, and the hum of ordinary occupation gone, so that you hear what the building is doing, the settling of old joinery, the complaint of the tin roof in the cold." Vashti's workshop made that silence. The two of them sat in it. She said, "She died the year he was born." He said, "Yes." She said, "He carved her face for 50 years. He said, "Yes," she said. "And there's no connection between the families. No church, no neighbor, no transaction, no record." He said, "Not yet. I may have missed something." She looked at him. She said, "You don't think you missed anything." He held his coffee with both hands. He looked at the photographs on the workbench. He said, "No." This is the moment the ordinary explanation should close around the question and hold it, and does not. A verbal description could account for the face. A skilled carver, told a face in sufficient detail by someone who had seen it, could learn it, could absorb it into the hands through the process of description repeated over time, the same way a musician learns a melody they cannot read, through hearing. Absalom Ree's hands were not ordinary hands. By every account, what they could absorb was probably not ordinary either. A verbal description from someone who had known Celia Vass, someone who had seen her face and carried its memory, and passed it to the blind boy in the hollow below Soapstone Ridge. This is possible. This is the most available explanation. Except Vashti spent 8 months looking for the person who might have given that description, and found no one. She is methodical. She worked the genealogical records, the church records that survived the years and the fires, the land grants, the probate filings, the tax lists. She built a map of the people who were alive in the relevant communities in the 1860s and 1870s, when Absalom Ree was learning the craft and making his first instruments. She looked for anyone who connected the Ree Hollow to the Vass family, anyone who might have moved between those communities, and carried the knowledge of Celia Vass's face. The families lived 12 miles apart, in terrain where 12 miles in 1860 was a meaningful distance. Not a morning's walk, but a decision, a reason, a purpose. 2 different branches of a single county, 2 different churches, 2 different social webs. The land between them was not settled continuously. There were gaps, ridges separated one watershed from another, in the way that ridges in the mountains create social as well as geographic separation. People on either side of such a ridge could live their entire lives knowing the other side existed without ever having reason to cross. She found no crossing, no record of any Ree family member in the Vass community, no record of any Vass connection to the Ree Hollow. Celia Vass died in 1851, leaving a husband and 2 young children, and within 5 years the family had moved down to Morganton and then dispersed further, leaving the hollow and the community entirely. By the time Absalom Ree was old enough to be learning his craft from Gideon Prophet, by the time he was old enough to be told anything about anyone, the Vass family was not there to tell. She said all of this to Marcus in her workshop in the cold. She said it the way you lay out evidence, carefully, in order, allowing each piece its own space. When she finished, Marcus nodded. He held his coffee. He said, "There's one more thing I found." He reached into the folder and took out a photocopy. It was a single page, A letter written in two hands. The first hand was careful, a woman's hand. The letters formed with the precision of someone who writes infrequently and takes care when they do. This was the body of the letter, an order to a hardware merchant in Morganton for hide glue and a new file. Ordinary, practical, the letter of a man who needs supplies and has someone to help him write. In the margin of that letter, in a second hand, shakier, less practiced, as if written hastily, or from feeling rather than from deliberation, were 5 words. He says he makes them for the one who shows him where. Marcus pointed at the 5 words. He did not say anything about them. He let Vashti read them, and read them again, and look up at him, and look back at the page, the one who shows him where, not the one who showed him. Present tense. As if at the time that margin note was written, the showing was ongoing. As if the instruction had not concluded. Vashti said, "Who wrote this?" Marcus said, "The letter is addressed and dictated by Absalom. The margin note appears to be in a different hand. Based on the family records, the most likely candidate is his daughter, Ruth Ree, born 1879, died 1941. A daughter who presumably knew her father's work as intimately as anyone, who lived in the workshop, who heard him talk to himself, who watched him carve the same face onto every instrument for as long as she could remember, who had written those 5 words in the margin. The way you write something down, not because you intend it to be read, but because it has pressed against the inside of your thoughts long enough that you have to put it somewhere. He says he makes them for the one who shows him where. Vashti looked at that sentence for a long time. Then she said, "She knew," Marcus said. "I think she knew something. What she understood it to mean, I can't say." Vashti set the photocopy down on the workbench. She looked at the photographs, the 43 scrolls, all that same face. She looked at the tintype. She looked at the letter. She said the instruments. All of them. He made them for her. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The elaboration was already there, in the photographs, in the wood, in the face that looked out from every scroll with those nearly closed eyes, and that quality of attention that Vashti had never been able to name precisely until this moment. Not contentment. Not sorrow. Attention. The face of someone who is present at something, watching over it, present at the making of each instrument, the whole 50 years of them. The cedar smell from the conference center fireplace was still in Vashti's memory. She smelled it now in her own workshop, which had no fireplace, which had only the walnut shavings and the cold air and the old wood of the building itself. She wondered if she was making connections that were not there, and then she thought, but that is what the evidence does. It draws the connection, and you follow the line, and the line goes where it goes. Here is what Vashti believes, which is not the same as what she can demonstrate. She believes Absalom Ree spent his life in the presence of something. Not a memory, not a verbal description absorbed and reproduced. He said yes, like answering someone, but something closer to accompaniment. The word she uses, privately, is accompaniment, the musical term for a thing that supports and follows and harmonizes with the primary voice. Whatever guided his hands, he experienced it as guidance, not as memory. The distinction matters to her, though she finds it difficult to articulate precisely why. She believes the face is Celia Vass's face. She believes this not because the resemblance is unmistakable, though it is, but because of the absence of any other candidate. No neighbor, no relation, no documented person whose face a sighted acquaintance might have described to him in sufficient detail to produce the consistency she has documented. The face had to come from somewhere, and the places she looked for it were all empty, and the place where it finally appeared, in the tintype of a dead woman from a family he had no documented connection to, is the only place it fits. She does not believe, will not claim to believe, that she knows how it was transmitted. That is the word she uses when she is being most careful. Transmitted. As if whatever the thing was, it had passed from Celia Vass to Absalom Ree, along some pathway that does not appear in the historical record, because the historical record does not have categories for it. He heard what he was given. The stone in the churchyard says. Vashti went to that churchyard on a morning in April, 6 months after the conference in Asheville, when the mountains were coming into green again, and the ramps were up, and the air had that particular green smell of new growth over old decay that is the smell of the Blue Ridge in early spring. The church itself is still standing, the building maintained by a small congregation, the churchyard in reasonable order. The older stones are the ones that give you trouble, the ones that have been in the ground since the 19th century and have settled and tilted, and in some cases sunk so far that only their crowns remain above the soil line, their text half legible, half lost. Absalom Ree's stone had tilted, not dramatically, but enough that the lower portion of the inscription was pressed into the wet earth of the churchyard, difficult to read. She knelt in the April mud and bent close. The upper part of the inscription was clear: Absalom Ree, 1851 to 1903. Below that, the second line was partly in the shadow of the tilt, partly pressed against the earth, but traceable if you put your fingers on the letters and followed them the way a blind man follows what he needs to know. She read it with her fingers. He heard what he was given. She stayed on her knees in the mud for a while after. The smell of the earth was right there, close and specific, wet clay and old grass, and the mineral cold of ground that has held frost all winter and is only now releasing it. A thing that does not look like itself from standing height, but is entirely itself when you are down in it. She thought about Absalom Ree carving in the dark of his workshop. She thought about his daughter watching him. She thought about the word heard on the stone, which was not the word made or built or worked. Heard, as if what he had done across 50 years was not production but reception, as if the instruments were not his to make but his to receive, and the making was secondary, the form that reception took in a man whose gift was his hands. She thought about the woman in the tintype, the way she was looking just past the camera. Then she got up, and she was careful about getting up because her knees are not what they were. And she brushed the mud from her coat, and she went back to her car and drove home on the state highway that follows the river and then climbs into the high country where the road narrows and the ridgelines crowd close, and you understand, as you drive it, why the communities here were separate from each other for so long. Not because the people were isolated by temperament, but because the terrain required it. And the communities made their own worlds within those requirements, and those worlds produced things that the flat country below never could. One of those things was Absalom Ree. His daughter Ruth is the absence at the center of this story, and Vashti has thought about her more than about any other figure in it, more even than about Absalom himself. Ruth was born in 1879, 28 years after Celia Vass died, 23 years into the making of the instruments. She grew up in the workshop, hearing her father work, hearing him say yes to the air, watching the same face appear at the end of every instrument after instrument, year after year. She knew what he was doing with the same completeness that you know the habits of a person you have lived beside all your life. She had a name for what she knew, or something close to a name, close enough to write in a margin. What she thought about it, she kept to herself. She sold the instruments after his death, one by one, and she kept the tools until the tools wore down, and she left no diary and wrote no reminiscence, and apparently told no historian. She is, in this story, the person who could answer the question and who chose not to. Vashti does not fault her for this. She says she understands it, though she does not specify what she understands it to mean. Whether Ruth's silence was protective of her father's memory or protective of something else, or whether Ruth simply did not know how to say what she knew in language that would not be misread. The instruments went out into the world. They went to neighbors and to strangers, and to people in the valley towns who had heard about the man in the hollow below Soapstone Ridge who made something remarkable. They went to churches, to households, to celebrations and to mournings, to the ordinary continuous occasions of mountain life. They were played. Some of them were played for generations. The sound of them moved through rooms and through time, and the face at the near end of each one moved with it, patient, watching, nearly closed eyes turned toward wherever the music went. A few of the instruments carried that sound until they gave out. Joints failed. Soundboards cracked in dry winters. Necks warped or broke. Wood is not permanent, it is slow, is all. A few were repaired, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with care. A few ended up in collections. A few ended up in consignment shops. The one Vashti found in the consignment shop in Boone was priced at $60. Unplayable. A crack in the soundboard, a missing fret, the strings long gone. But the body was intact. The scroll was intact. She turned it over in the shop and saw the face, and set it back on the shelf, and looked at it for a moment, and then she picked it up again, and carried it to the register and set it down and paid $60 without saying a word about what it was. The woman at the register said, "Nice find." Vashti said, "Yes." She carried it to her car and sat in the parking lot in the December dark, the heater going, the smell of the old walnut filling the small space, and she held the instrument in her lap and looked at the face in the dim light from the parking lot lamps and felt, as she always felt with these instruments, the thing she cannot name. She has 45 now. The folder in the drawer has 45 photographs. She is not done looking. This is what Vashti told me. In her workshop, in November, with the walnut shavings on the bench, and the flat gray light coming through the high window, and the smell of old wood and linseed oil around us. She told me methodically, in order, giving me the evidence, and then her interpretation of it, and then, carefully, the line between those two things. She is the kind of person who keeps the line clear. It costs her something to keep it clear in this case. I could see that it did, but she kept it. At the end, she set the walnut dulcimer from Watauga County in my hands and turned the scroll toward me. I looked at the face. Small, smaller than I had imagined, and very precise. I looked at it for a long time. The workshop was quiet the way a workshop is quiet when the work has stopped, and the tools are resting, and the wood is just wood, just sitting, just being what it is. I said, "She looks like she's listening." Vashti said, "Yes, every one of them does." We sat with that for a while. Outside, the light was going, the short November afternoon closing down. Someone on the road past the workshop was driving slowly on account of the ice that was forming again on the pavement, and the sound of the tires on it came through the walls of the building as a slow complaint, a drawn-out friction. I thought about Absalom Ree in his workshop below Soapstone Ridge, in the lamplight, the tools in his hands, carving a face he could not see into the end of an instrument that would carry a sound he would never stop knowing how to make. I thought about him saying yes to the air the way Orpha remembered it. Answering, not initiating, responding to something that had already spoken. I thought about a woman named Celia Vass, 31 years old, in a photographer's studio in the valley somewhere, looking just past the camera lens at the long exposure time, holding still. Her expression, that particular stillness of someone who has decided to be present for this, and to let the image take what it takes. Not knowing, how could she know what the image would become? Where it would travel? Who would follow it, with hands instead of eyes, across 50 years and 200 instruments, into walnut and cherry and tulip poplar, and the last of the American chestnut? Not knowing that the year the image was made or the year she died, there was a child coming into a hollow 12 miles away in the Blue Ridge, coming into the dark, coming in without sight, coming into a world he would spend the rest of his life describing with his hands, coming in, as far as anyone can determine, already in some way knowing her. The reservoir above Ree's Branch is still there. The water is still green-black, still deep, still cold even in summer when the surface is warm enough to swim. What it holds it does not return. The grist mill that gave the hollow its name is 30 feet under. The workshop, whatever remained of it in 1962 when they dammed the creek, is down there too, in the dark and the cold, in the pressure of all that still water. The tools. Whatever shavings were on the bench, whatever the walls had absorbed in 50 years of his working in them, if there was anything else there, if there was anything of her still present in that space, after all those years of his attention. It is under the water now. The water does not give it back. There are instruments out there that have not been documented. Instruments in closets and attics and the back rooms of churches, in homes where no one knows what they have, played hard and set aside and covered over. The scroll facing the wall or the dark, the face patient, repeating its expression into the wood and the air, and whatever air carries that we have not yet named. If you have a Dulcimer from the Carolina mountains, old, the joints going dark, the finish worn to the wood at the edges, with a carved head at the near end where the strings terminate, turn it over. Look at the scroll. See whether there is a face. See whether the nose runs straight with a deviation at the bridge, to the left. See whether one ear sits higher than the other by a small margin. See whether the eyes are nearly closed, the expression that particular kind of present that looks like waiting but is something more active than waiting. Looks like attending, like a person hearing something in a room that the rest of the room has not caught yet. Vashti would want to know. The folder in her drawer has room for more. The man who made those instruments was born without sight and died having spent 50 years insisting, in the only vocabulary available to him, that he had known a woman he could not have seen and could not have met. He said the wood already had it. He said she showed him where to put his hands. He said he had always carried it, the way you carry the sound of a name you have heard so often. It no longer requires the hearing. It is simply present, part of the air of the room where you have always lived. His daughter wrote 5 words in the margin of a letter and did not explain them and did not need to. The instrument said what explanation could not. Some images arrive in us from before we could have received them. We do not know what to call this. We reach for the vocabulary of memory and find it does not fit. We reach for the vocabulary of inheritance and find it close but not quite. We reach for other words, older words, words from the traditions that the mountains held and still hold in certain places where the old knowledge did not fully leave. And those words may be closer, but they carry their own burdens of misunderstanding. So we sit with it. We hold it the way Vashti holds an instrument she is learning, not pressing, not demanding, letting the object offer what it is willing to offer in its own time. He heard what he was given. He carved what he heard, and the face he carved is still there, in the wood, in the collections, and the closets, and the church in Lenoir, with the instrument on the display shelf near the door. Still there in the drawer in Vashti's workshop in Boone, 45 photographs, same face, 45 times, quiet and patient and attending. Still looking just past the camera at something the camera could not catch. You know that feeling, the one where you understand something that you cannot explain, where the understanding arrives in the body before the mind has words for it, where your hands know something your voice has not caught up to yet. You have had that feeling. Everyone who works with their hands has had it. Everyone who has held a very old object, or stood in a very old place, or heard a piece of music that seemed to know something about you that you had not told it. Absalom Ree spent 50 years in that feeling. 50 years and 200 instruments. A face he had never seen, carved so completely, so consistently, with such fidelity to a specific and individual human life, that a woman holding a tintype in Asheville 150 years later could stand at a folding table with a work light on it, and know, without being told, without needing to be told, that she was looking at the same person. That is what happened. The facts are the facts. What they mean is the question the drawer holds, and the drawer stays closed, and the face in the wood goes on being patient, and somewhere below the reservoir the water is cold and still, and keeping its own counsel about what it covers. He was blind from birth. He carved her face 200 times. She had been dead since the morning he came into the world. Tell me what you think that means, and then tell me why, when you try to answer, your hands know the answer before your mouth does.